All right, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started a little earlier since we have the time. And hopefully that means we can end a little earlier too. And then we'll all have a little bit of time before the after party. So that's good. And I promise I'll try to make my talk go a little smoothly because I know I'm the last thing between all of you and dinner. But also myself and dinner, and I want to get through that. So I am Adam McNeilly. I am an Android engineer at OkCupid in New York City. We're also hiring. If you're interested, you can talk to me after. But today we're going to talk about the magical robot pattern and how we can use that to make our espresso tests a lot better than what we have now, if we have any at all. I know a lot of people aren't really doing automated testing, but hopefully after this talk you'll see it's not so bad and we'll get into it. So we'll start off with an overview of espresso for any of you who haven't used it, and then we'll go into how the robot pattern saves the day and then some additional cool tricks we can use with it. So what is espresso? I'm sure most of you have heard of this buzzword, and many of you might have worked with it and are using it in your apps. But any of you who are new, you might not be. So Espresso is an automated testing framework that's built by Google that lets you write code to automate your user interface and make sure it behaves the way that you expect it to. There are some alternatives to this that you may have heard of, like Appium and UI Automator. And the robot pattern applies to those as well, but we're not going to really get into the differences. I just wanted to call that out because, like Phil said this morning, don't only listen to me. This talk includes a lot of tools that I'm familiar with. But there are alternatives, and the high-level ideas are going to apply to all of them. But for those of you, again, who are new to this, as far as following along with today's example, there's really only 3 classes that you need to worry about to follow along. And those are ViewMatchers, ViewActions, and ViewAssertions. And I'll explain each of them in detail. So ViewMatchers are tools that Espresso, or methods, so it's a class of methods that Espresso uses to find a view on your screen that it needs to interact with. So you might tell Espresso, I want you to work with a view that has a specific ID, or find any view that has some text. Or even different flags on it, like if it's focusable, if it's checked. You can use one or many of these, and the biggest thing to keep in mind when you dive into Espresso is that these views have to be on the screen, and you have to have enough to find a unique view. If you try to find a view with text, and there's multiple ones with text, well, you're going to get some ambiguous view error, and if it's not on the screen, Espresso can't find it, and it can't interact with it. So those are 2 important notes to keep in mind. ViewActions are the fun part of Espresso. This is where you get to tell it how to automate your user interface. So you might have something on your screen and you want to type text into an input or scroll to a position in a list, swipe on a view, or even click on a button. And you would use these to sort of run through the steps that you might do manually. And we see more of that later. But the testing portion of all of this are the ViewAssertions. So after you've found a view and you've performed some actions on it, you now want to check some assertions. Maybe you want to make sure a view matches a set of conditions, or that it doesn't exist. Typically what you might do is you want to find a view and check that it matches a given text, and that's the example we use later. Or make sure a view has disappeared, things like that. The Espresso documentation has a really good cheat sheet on this that breaks down all the different categories and the methods that are involved. I definitely recommend checking this out. It's a great learning resource. And also keeping in mind that all of these are extensible. You can write your own ViewMatchers and ViewAssertions, which really come in handy if you write your own custom views. You can still use those for your Espresso testing. You might just have to write some sort of custom assertions depending on what type of class you use and things like that. So now that we have that information, let's look at a high-level example of what our Espresso code is going to look like. So the first thing we'll do is call onView with some ViewMatcher. And what that does is it uses the ViewMatcher to find something on the screen, and onView gives us a view interaction where we can then perform an action or check an assertion. And those methods are pretty much exactly as they sound. you can call it .perform and then pass it in a view action or multiple view actions that you want to occur. Or you call check with some view assertions you want to make on that. So a super basic real-world example of this is, let's say we have an app that has an edit text where I can put some information in, and I've got a text view, and I want to make sure that whatever I typed in is in the text view. So the way we do that is by calling onView and then passing a ViewMatcher, which in this case is with ID, r.id.at input, and that gives us our view interaction. And then we'll perform some actions. In this case, we want to type the text of my first name. Cool. So now the next thing we'll do is call onView for another view interaction, and the matcher here is with ID to the output. In this case, we're going to check an assertion, and that time we're going to check that it matches some conditions, and that's with the text Adam. So if all of this works, this will be a passing text. I typed in Adam, I see Adam in the output. So that's what you get if you sort of follow through the Espresso docs as they're written. So now let's go into an example where we have an application and we want to implement this. And I promise I eventually get to robots, but I think it's important to sort of walk through Espresso and see how we would build things and then understand how the robot's going to come in and save the day for us. So here's a really basic sample, which is just like a registration form that lets the user enter their first name, their last name, email, and phone number. They will click the registration button, and as you'll see, it'll pass to like a user profile screen that just displays their information. But it's formatted special, and so what we want to test is just that we can walk through this registration test, get the expected output. But again, before we introduce robots, I think it's really important to walk through Espresso as we've learned it and as the docs present it to us, and then we can show how the robots solve that problem. So given what I've told you, if we tried to consider some tests we might write for this sample app, first we're going to test, like, can I register successfully? Can I enter all the information? And am I taken to another screen that displays my information correctly? But I also might write some negative tests, like if I leave a field out, I want to show an error that something went wrong, or maybe an invalid email address, I want to show a specific error for that. So this is what our test successful registration would look like. I know it's a lot, but if you follow through it kind of slowly, you can really follow along. So on the first line, we find a view with an ID of ET first name, perform an action, type in text, my first name. Then find a view with an ID of ET last name, perform an action, type the text of my last name. Then find a view with an ID of ET email, perform an action, type the text of my email address. I promise this will be the only test that I walk you through line by line. But if I go again, find a view with an ID of ET phone, perform an action, type in my phone number, then find the register button and click it. Hopefully by now you've kind of seen the pattern on these lines. And at the end, we'll create some view interactions, check some assertions, and make sure these views have like my formatted full name and my formatted phone number. That's a lot. It was really verbose. It took a long time for me to walk through, especially if I had read you every single one. One of the plus sides to Espresso, though, that I have to appreciate is all of these method names are really nice and really explanatory. Even though it took me some time to walk through that slide with you, I understood just by the names of each method what was happening. But I might argue that I can do that line by line, but by the time I get to the end of the test, I might have really forgotten all the steps that I've taken, with the exception of like test successful registration, which kind of gives it away. But let's look at an example if we left a field out. Like if I don't enter my email address, I want to see an error text that says, must enter an email address. And a lot of this test looks the same as the one you've already seen. Find a view with an ID of ET first name, type that in. Last name, I left out the email line here. Then we enter phone, click register, and then we want to find our email view and check that it has certain error text. I think it makes sense if you, again, follow through with these sort of clear method names, but at a really quick glance, if I go between these, it might not be obvious what the difference in your test is. And that's not fun for anybody who has to try and debug your test or understand what you were testing and how. And it gets even worse if you look at like a negative test, like an invalid email error, where I see that I've found each of my input fields and I've typed some actions in, and it's not until you get to the last line, find a view with an ID of E2 email, check that it matches, that it has error text, that you understand what was being tested there. But again, and I like to keep calling this out, at least the method names are understandable, but I argue at the end of the day that this is unreadable. This is a lot of code, and it's really hard to read, not just because it's small on the screen, but I went through all of that effort following the Espresso docs to write 3 tests. And that's the simple effort that you guys see here. If any of you have actually worked with Espresso, you know you've probably gone through working to understand views have to be on the screen, and you want to turn off animations because animations can bite you when you're working with Espresso. And I don't know about you, but for anyone who has used Espresso, when I dug into it the first time, and I got to this point and I realized how much effort goes into just writing 3 tests, I gave up. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's alone in that, right? Because you just start to feel like you're putting in so much effort and you don't really see the benefits out of it. I could have tested my registration form just as quickly. So to recap kind of exactly what I said, the problem we have with following along with Espresso, as it's presented to us, there's nothing wrong with the way I wrote that. If I go into the docs and I look at other samples online, that's what you're going to come up with, and that's fine and understandable, but you are left with something that's unfortunately extremely verbose and unreadable. But maybe even a bigger problem that a lot of people don't like is that this is not easy to maintain. The way I've written my tests, they're so closely coupled with the view, because I need to know the view's ID and things like that, that if I want to go change my registration form, I have to go change every single one of my tests. And if you didn't give up by writing verbose tests, you definitely gave up when you decided it wasn't worth your time to go maintain them. So to recap, it's because we have no separation of concerns here. You know, many of you are probably familiar with different architectures in your app. Phil talked about this earlier today too. You might implement something like MVP or MVVM or MVWTF at this point, but the main point of each of those architectures, right, it doesn't matter which one you choose, they all have the same core purpose, which is to separate concerns in your app. MVP works because your view doesn't care about your model. It doesn't care where data comes from or how it's fetched. So if I have like a presenter as a middleman, I can go in and I can swap out my database for network calls. And I don't have to change my view because it didn't care. Similarly, for if I want to change the view, but the model stays the same, that's all fine and dandy. And we can do that, and we only have to tweak that middleman, which is the presenter, maybe not at all, but we don't have that same benefit with our tests. Our Espresso test is so closely coupled with the view that if we need to change it, we got to go change the test. And that gets a lot worse as we add more tests, because it's just more places that I have to go make changes. So you end up with something like this. That's not fun for anybody. You end up abandoning your tests, and everyone's fine with it because everyone understands, but then you're disappointed you don't have automated tests anymore. So finally, this is where we can introduce the robot, which helps us a lot because the robot is our middleman between our tests and our view. It kind of serves the same purpose as a presenter, right? Because at the end of the day, the view itself, it has no concern with your test. There's nothing there. And your test doesn't really care that much about the implementation of the view. It just needs to know, what do I need, what actions do I need to perform on the view? And you can separate out those concerns by using a robot. And then the benefit you get is you change your view, you only have to change your robot. This is a lot less red boxes than you saw in the first example. So again, to continue this sort of pattern of explaining it and then coming back to show it is, let's talk about like the end goal with robots and what our tests will look like after that, and then I'll show you how you can implement them. But I think the end goal, and to go back about how your test doesn't really care about how your view is implemented, it would be really cool if you could write your automated tests as if you were telling a quality assurance engineer what to do, right? Because that's, at a high level, that's the purpose of the Espresso test is you don't want to have your QA engineer go in and test your registration form every time if you can automate something like that. But you wouldn't go to your QA person and say, find a view with this ID and then perform these actions, and then find a view with this ID, and you wouldn't tell it to them like that. you'd go up to them in English and you'd say, fill out the registration form, click the button, make sure your data is displayed. Maybe you go in depth and you say, enter your first name, enter your last name, email, phone number, click the button. That makes more sense. That's how we as humans have conversations. So that's the goal we want to get to with robots, is we want to be able to change that ugly test I showed you in the beginning, following, the information that we're given, and change it into something like this, where my test successful registration test no longer cares about how each of these fields are implemented or what their IDs are or anything like that. My test just wants to enter a first name, enter a last name, enter an email, enter a phone, click the register button, and then run a few assertions. And so this is the output we get out of the robot pattern, which is really nice. And to implement it is not that bad because we already understand Espresso. You know what each of these underlying steps are doing. So you just need to abstract it out into its own little class. So the way I like to write my robot classes is I'll just create a class called registration robot. And I'll take all of my ViewMatchers that I want, and I like to put them in like a companion object or static fields in Java because I can have them all in one place, and it handles a simple case where you just change an ID, and then you just have to go change one ViewMatcher. And then the bulk of this is that we write each action our robot can take inside its own method. So in this case, I just highlighted 3 of them. But in the top, you see we have a first name method, which takes in the first name that we want to input on our screen. And this is where we can write that really long Espresso code. Find a view that matches our first name conditions, perform some actions, and in this case, when I'm actually writing these, I like to clear out the text, type the text, and close the keyboard. It might sound like overkill, but working with Espresso, it's really good to do stuff like that. In theory, your input's going to be empty, but you might want to clear out anything that was there, then type in what you want. And you really want to close the keyboard because, as I mentioned in the beginning, Espresso only works when views are visible. And even if you think it's on the screen, but it's behind the keyboard, it's not visible. And that's a big headache, so hopefully I saved you all from that headache. I can see someone who I didn't, who's already experienced that headache. And then our register one works the same way. There's no parameters here because I just want to click a button. So I find that button, and I perform the click action. And then assertion is similar. I take in the text that I'm expecting to see. And so I find that view that matches my full name conditions, and check that it matches the text of whatever full name I passed in. And you may notice that all of these kind of return the same instance of the robot. This is called a builder pattern, and you're probably familiar with it from alert dialogues and things like that. But the biggest benefit of using the builder pattern with these is you can now chain your calls together. So as you saw in the first example, we just called it line after line, and that's really nice with readability, but you also have full control over your test. You can change the order in which you call certain methods, because your robot doesn't care about that either. It just exposes all the different actions you can take. So if I wanted to know what might happen if I entered phone number first, I can easily write a test like that. Some tips I have along with this robot pattern once you've created something like this. Always use one robot per screen. This helps your robots from getting bloated and just handling too much, but then it's easy to see in your different classes, like what's relevant to each screen. So in my example where I go from the registration form to a user profile, my test is going to pass flow off to a user profile robot at the end. You may notice that I create my registration robot and perform those actions, and then I create a user profile robot and perform the actions that apply to the user profile. I think it can be instinctive sometimes to just have your register method return the new robot. And if you are always going to go to a new screen, that can work. But in my example, if I click the register button and my form is invalid, I don't actually go to the profile screen, I stay and show an error. So if I had tried to make register return a new robot, I've really backed myself into a corner because now how would I write a negative test, you know? So try to keep your robots separate and only chain them together if you know like a view is consistently chaining. But this is what a negative test would look like then, where since register still returns a registration robot for me, I could just run my assertions right at the end. Since I've built out my robot with every action I could take, really easy to just plop that line in at the end too. So hopefully you guys have seen them, but what are the benefits that we got out of this? I mean, first and foremost, and the most obvious one, is readability. We went from methods that would take us a few minutes to read left to right, method by method, and try to understand what each line is doing, to having a very clear understanding of, I'm just entering the first name. We now have maintainability and separation of concerns, which is huge. So now you can rely on having these tests a lot longer, and you don't end up in that scenario where you overhaul your view a little bit and you just abandon the test because it's not worth your time. Now that you only have to update your robot and keep all those tests, hopefully you think it is worth your time. And tests become a lot easier to write, and I don't mean this just from the fact of you're writing them in plain English and you're writing them in fewer lines of code, but if you take the time to build out a robot for your screen, and you've written every sort of action and assertion that can apply to that screen, it's really easy for you to write a test for like every possible permutation of actions, right? In my registration form, I only had 4 fields, but I label each of them as required. So if you leave any of them empty, you should show an error. So that's 4 negative tests I would have to write, plus my invalid email test, and using the old way of what I learned from the Espresso docs is I probably wouldn't have taken the time. Or what I would have done is I would have written one test, and I would have copy and pasted it, and then just tweaked it slightly. And we all know copy and paste errors happen all the time. But once I've got a clear robot, I can go ahead and really test all these different things, which is nice. But what other kind of benefits can we get from this? This is really nice so far. And again, it's not really been specific to Espresso. Or even automated testing. I've used this pattern for some integration tests where I want to test a view model, and what's really nice about it is I can chain my calls together in different orders, and I want to test, well, what happens if I try to do this first or this second? So now I want to introduce something really cool that is specific to Espresso, and I'm going to present the idea and then go through that, and then I'm going to circle back again to show why robots were necessary for this. But I think it's easy to walk through it. And for me, that's better test reporting. Using the robot pattern, you can get way better test reporting, and I promise I'll circle back and show you why it's really only realistically possible if you're using this pattern. Otherwise, it's a pain. But 2 tools that I like to use that I'm going to demonstrate are Spoon and Falcon. Spoon is a library that runs all of your instrumentation tests for you and then builds you a static HTML report at the end of everything that was tested. And it also allows you to take screenshots, which is really cool. You can take screenshots along the way, and that's what's used in your report. I don't know if this was fixed, but when I started learning it, Spoon had an issue where it couldn't really capture dialogues in screenshots. So people who were showing an alert dialogue and wanted to capture that were having some trouble. And that's where Falcon comes in to save the day. It's another screenshotting library that is able to capture dialogues and overlays in your view. And they even have a Spoon compat library, which gives you the best of both worlds, so you can have those really powerful Falcon screenshots and still get your static, beautiful Spoon report. Just a funny note that I love to share is like Espresso and Spoon together might not always be the most search engine friendly. I've found myself in this exact same situation. So if you're going to check it out, try to throw in another keyword like Square or Android. And this is an example of what it gives you. So this is an overview of like my test invalid email error, where I take a screenshot at every step along the way because I want to understand what my test is, and I come back to that specific idea. But what the report gives you is a screenshot that you've taken at every step. You can hover over one like this, and you can see, this is the screenshot that was taken after I entered my phone number. And this is just beautiful, human readable, but I come back to those details later. I just want to give you an overview, like this is what you get from Spoon. Before I talk about like what and how, if you're going to do something like this, and this ties directly into the robot pattern, as I'll come back to, it's like, well, when would you want to take screenshots if you're going to do something like this? You want to take it after some assertions. Like I want to assert that this view has this certain text, and then I'm going to take a screenshot to prove it, right? Similarly, you'll take it after actions. I'm going to type some text into an edit text. I want to take a screenshot that says, hey, I entered this text. Unless that action is going to lead to another screen, like a button click, you'll want to take your screenshot first. And the idea behind that is like, here's what's on the screen before I click the register button. And maybe you're seeing a pattern like, I can look at these tests and just by looking at these screenshots, I get an idea what was in the developer's head when they were writing these tests and how. And then always take a screenshot on failure. And this is huge and probably the most helpful point, at least in my experience. And I'll show you why that's really helpful. But why screenshots? Why did I think this was so important to kind of interject a talk on the robot pattern to present screenshots? Screenshots give you, and I'll list these out and explain them in detail. Screenshots give you human readable output, which is really nice. You get to see exactly how things were tested, and you can diagnose failures quicker, which came back to that failure screenshot I mentioned. So for any of you who've written any kind of test, even if they're not instrumentation tests, you're used to seeing this sort of console output, which is okay, but it's for developers only, right? Like, not just because developers are the only ones who use IDEs, but this is sort of written in developer lingo. There's a package name in there, and the other problem with it is it tells me what was tested, so I can see that I tested a successful registration. I can see that I tested an invalid email error and a missing email error, but it doesn't tell me how it was tested. And so a really skeptical person might look at this and be like, well, I don't know how you're testing this. I don't know if you're appropriately checking for a missing email error, right? As opposed to the sort of spoon output we get, which is very nice and visual. You can see a screenshot of every step along the way, and this is nice because it's shareable. Your console output is just for you, but I can take this HTML report and I can share it with my QA team, and I can say, all right, well, here's what I tested via automation, and they can focus their manual testing on whatever was excluded. And you can also go to your project manager and say, here's all of the things that I tested. We know this is working, and we can ship with a little more confidence, and that makes project managers really happy. And when they're happy, we're happy, right? But also, as I said, console output only tells us what. It doesn't tell us how. But that's what we get from these screenshots, is we get to see every step that was taken. So in my registration test, I see a screenshot when I enter my first name, last name, email, phone, click the button, and then assert the different views. And so everyone's in agreement, like, okay, this is how we define and test a successful registration, where we didn't really have that before. We just said we tested it, but two people might have clashing ideas on like what defines a successful registration, right? And as far as diagnosing failures, this is kind of what you get from the old way is you run your Espresso test and something would fail and you'd have to jump into the stack trace, which are usually pretty helpful in Android. You see a stack trace, you click on the first blue link, and then you go try and figure out why that line was wrong. That's what I do, right? But these Espresso stack traces really aren't immediately helpful. So if we look at the top line, blah, 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 assertion failed with cause error, with text is Adam McNeilly, doesn't match the expected view. It says expected with text is Adam McNeilly. So in the first two lines, I have no idea what the problem is. And then it tells me about the app.compat text view that it found. And I could read you every single property here, but what you might not realize is not until the very last line in the center that I find, oh, the text is just Adam. So if I'm reading this, I realize, oh crap, where I was expecting to display a full name, I'm only displaying my first name. But imagine if you saw that same sort of high-level error right next to a screenshot, where I could see, oh, they were expecting the text Adam McNeilly, but what's on my screen is just Adam. And now in half the time, I figured out exactly what my mistake was. I was only displaying my first name. So screenshots help us a lot there. That was a really quick run-through of them. If you want to learn more about screenshots in general and the different tools that are available other than Spoon and Falcon, definitely check out this DroidCon 2016 talk by Sam Edwards. It's really helpful. And like I said, it goes more into depth of the purpose of screenshots and the different tools that are available. I just told you the ones that are familiar with me, but don't only listen to me, right? So to circle back around, I kind of went on a tangent to run through screenshots really quickly, But how does that relate to the robot pattern? Well, in the slide where I told you when to take screenshots, that becomes really easy to add because we already have every step of our test broken out into a robot. So I can go into the first name method and I remember, oh, we take a screenshot after an action. So I just have to plug in my take screenshot method right after I enter the first name. And sure, it's a little tedious because I have to go through and do it to every method, but at least my methods are already broken out by step, right? And then this is an example of how you can set a Espresso failure handler that will take a screenshot anytime a test fails and pass off that control right back to the default error handler. And some of you might be asking, like, okay, that's cool because we broke it out by every step, but did we really need a robot to take screenshots? Well, would you wanted to end up with something like this? Your tests were not maintainable and hard to read as it is. Now imagine trying to interject a screenshot everywhere you would want to take one. By the way, this is the successful registration test that you saw in the beginning, but now with a screenshot for every step. And no one wants to read this or maintain this, and so I'd argue that without a robot at all, you wouldn't be able to achieve test reporting in the way that you can if you do implement something like this. So now you've got something that's readable, you've got something that's maintainable, you can do better test reports with it, you can write your tests a lot faster, and it solves a lot of the problems that we as developers use as reasons to stop doing automated testing. So hopefully that helps. And to kind of really nail it and prove this, let's consider an example where we would have to add to this. So we've got our simple registration form, which I just kept very basic in the app because I didn't want to deal with anything flashy. I just wanted to show Espresso and how we can work with it. But imagine we've got a registration form and now we're given a requirement that we want to add an email opted-in field, which is a pretty valid concern we could get. And I'm not going to talk about the work that it takes to add this to the app, but in my example, I just plop it in the same XML file as the form and throw a checkbox on the user profile fragment. But what would it take to modify our test to be able to handle this? Is that extra button going to make my test harder to maintain? Well, not really, because for our registration robot, we just have to add one new method called email opt-in. And what we do there is we find that opt-in view that we've just added and click it, because in this case it's just a radio button, and add in our screenshot method and return this for our builder pattern. And that's all it took to add email opt-in to our registration robot, just a few seconds. A user profile robot is pretty straightforward. You could have done this by having assert opt-in status and passed it in a Boolean, but I like to separate them out and to understand the two different states. But all we do in here is we find that opt-in display that we've added to our user profile fragment and just check that it matches an is checked condition, or in the second example, is not checked, and take our screenshots. Really easy to add those to our robot. So what about our tests? 2 lines, right? In the registration part, we just add email opt-in, and then at the end of the user profile fragment, we assert opted-in status. So we've shown if you take the time to design your tests appropriately and you abstract them out with the same sort of separation of concerns that you apply to your actual app, your tests as a whole become more maintainable, and you don't back yourself into that corner where a requirement like this makes you give up on your tests and think that it's not worth the time. So I also apparently flew through my presentation, but let's recap some of the things we talked about here. The main point that I want to be taken away is use these robots to solve that separation of concerns problem, because as I've been talking to more developers about testing, I found that's one of the main examples of when people stop implementing their tests is they go through the work of implementing Espresso, and then as soon as something changes and they find out how much work they have to do to reorganize that test, they give up. So use this to solve that problem. But it makes your test more readable and fun to write, which is nice, and I really do think it's fun to write. Once you've built a robot, And you can go through all those permutations and it doesn't take that much time. Automating your user interface is fun to go do that and then see it run on the screen, and then you feel bad because you wonder oh, did I just take someone's job away? But once you get past that, seeing your test automated is pretty cool. Once you have that in place, you can leverage this for better test reporting, which makes you happy, makes QA happy, makes your project manager happy. Everyone sleeps at night because they can ship with a lot more confidence and they have the reports to prove it. And I just want to make sure I recap. I showed 3 tools that I really like to work with, and I haven't personally found a lot of problems with them. But this overall idea of using robots for readable and maintainable tests isn't specific to any of the tools I showed you today. So if you're already implementing sort of one of those other UI automation frameworks, or you've got some other screenshot tool in already maybe, you don't have to swap those out for what I showed you today. You can take a lot of these ideas at a high level and implement those too. And if you want to see an example, I have this project up on GitHub, and I should mention the link to the slides is on my Twitter if I didn't call that out. But this will take you to a sample project that has the automation test built out for that sort of registration example you saw, as well as links in the README to all of the tools that I used here, and some other resources that I think are pretty helpful. That's all I got. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me afterwards, or I'll be at the dinner tonight too, but thank you.